Welcome to the respiratory system. It's more than just your breath. So we're going to talk about today is how respiration is more than just breathing. That's what everyone thinks of. It has to do with breathing in and breathing out, but there's more to it to that. There's actually a two-step process. One, the most obvious, is what you do know, that it's taking in oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide. But the second thing that we're going to spend some time on today is how it's also at the cellular level, how we use oxygen in a chemical reaction to turn our food into energy. And that is called cellular respiration. More about that later, though. And it happens in the mitochondria. Here's the definition of the respiratory system: the group of organs that take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide waste. At the cellular level, this is used to convert food into energy. And we see here some of the organs that we're going to be talking about in this presentation. We're going to go on a little tour of the respiratory system, and the way in, the main entrance is through the nose. And it's called the main entrance because its primary purpose is for breathing. The mouth is considered the secondary entrance because sometimes your mouth is busy. The mouth is only used as a backup if your nose can't take in oxygen. So in other words, if you have a stuffed up nose. But the mouth's other purposes are eating, talking, etc., drinking liquids. And so sometimes the mouth is busy, therefore the nose has to be doing the work to take in the oxygen. From there, we go through the pharynx, which is that short passageway right behind the nose and the mouth, and it leads to the larynx. The pharynx is from here to about here, and you don't need to know these different sections of the pharynx, but nasopharynx means behind the nose, oropharynx behind the mouth, and laryngopharynx right by the larynx. The larynx is also known as your vocal cords, and it's that pair of elastic bands that stretch over the opening, and they vibrate as sound goes through them. We can change the vibrations and change the pitch by making the vocal cords tighter or looser. And if you haven't yet seen this video, I recommend you watch this from the link on RomanNet, so you can see 4 different larynxes singing in harmony. It's pretty amazing to watch how that little tiny flap, those 2 flaps of tissue work to make sound. Next, as we go down the respiratory system, is the trachea, and it's sometimes just called your throat. This is a opening, but to get into it, there's this small flap here that you can see in the animation that closes every time you swallow. That's called the epiglottis, and the epiglottis's job is to keep food and drinks out of the trachea, and the trachea has to be for air only. And sometimes we all know that if you swallow something and it gets in the trachea, it makes us very uncomfortable, and we cough it up and choke on it, and we say it's going down the wrong pipe, and it literally is like a pipe. This is the esophagus, where the food should go and the drinks, and the trachea is for air only. And it's also known as the windpipe because it leads to the lungs. All around the whole thing, it is reinforced with these rings of cartilage, thick cartilage that keeps the passageway open at all times. And you can even feel that in your throat. Right here, you can feel how there's these rings of thicker cartilage, like the tissue in your ear is made of cartilage. This is what the epiglottis looks like at the back of the throat, and this is also made of cartilage that when you swallow it, the flap goes down as a reflex. You don't have to think about doing it, it just happens, so that no food or water or milk or Pepsi gets into your trachea. After we leave the trachea, it splits into 2 pathways, and each one is called a bronchus. Both of them together, the plural, is called bronchi or bronchi. And they both split into each separate lung. Then the smaller the bronchi get, then we start calling them bronchioles. And they are they start to look like branches of a tree as they get smaller and smaller. And eventually they end with these little sacs of air, and these sacs of air are called alveoli. And this is where all the oxygen is being taken in, and then it's passed to these capillaries that we studied in the respiratory system unit. And at the same time, carbon dioxide is being given to the from the blood cells to the alveoli, and then we exhale it back out, back through the bronchioles, through the bronchi, trachea, larynx, pharynx, mouth, nose, back out. So that's, oh, and there's one more. How does air get in? There's no muscles in your lungs, so it has to happen with some help from another muscle here called the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is right below your rib cage, and it's a dome-shaped muscle that when it pulls down, it creates a vacuum in your lungs, and then air outside of your mouth is forced in because of that vacuum. Then when it relaxes, it pushes up, and that air is squeezed out back the way it came. But as it happens, the oxygen and carbon dioxide are being exchanged quickly, and in and out, all through our lives, every second it's happening. Now the lungs also have some separate lobes, and the right lung has 3 smaller sections that we call lobes. There's an upper lobe here, there's a middle lobe, and behind it and a little lower is the lower lobe. But the left lung just has 2 lobes, upper and lower. And that is because nestled right here, a little to the left of center, is your heart. And if there were 3 lobes in the lung on the left, there wouldn't be room for the heart. So those are the lobes of your lungs. Now we're going to talk about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration does not mean your cell phone, but it's how oxygen is used by our cells to release energy stored in the molecules of glucose. I said in class that it's sort of like, imagine the glucose is a stick of dynamite and the oxygen is a match. Without that match, the dynamite is useless. It doesn't explode on its own. And without oxygen, the glucose can't be converted into energy. Every time we inhale, our oxygen is carried by the red blood cells to every other tissue cell in our body. At the same time, those tissues are also getting glucose delivered to them from the digestive system and the blood. In the cell, the mitochondria will use the oxygen and take the glucose molecules apart, turning them into energy in the end. While it's doing that, it's going to make 2 waste products, carbon dioxide and water. We release the carbon dioxide when we breathe, and the water, some of it is stored and saved for later, but then a lot of it is transported to the urinary system. So we're going to go into a little more detail about how this works. The energy that your cells use is called ATP, short for adenosine triphosphate, and it is a type of nucleic acid just like DNA and RNA. But this nucleic acid is how we power every cell in our body. The formula is glucose plus oxygen yields or reacts to form carbon dioxide, water, and then ATP. This is what we really wanted, and while these 2 here are just waste products. And if you've ever studied photosynthesis, you'll see that this is pretty much the exact opposite of photosynthesis. Instead of ATP, plants use sunlight energy, but they need water, they need carbon dioxide, and they create glucose and oxygen. The difference with plants and animals is that animals can't do that, so we can only do this part, glucose and oxygen turning into ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. But plants do respiration after they do photosynthesis. They make their own glucose with photosynthesis, and then they use it in cellular respiration. Now on the left side of this equation, or any chemical equation, we have what are called reactants. They are called that because they react to something or to each other. And when those 2 reactants get together, they cause a chemical reaction, and they usually will create something called a product. And we have here the 3 products of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So let's talk about how cellular respiration happens. There are 3 steps, and the first step is called glycolysis, and this happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. Glucose is way too big to be entering into the mitochondria and be used there, and this happens in the cytoplasm, and does not use oxygen, but the glucose is broken down into 2 smaller molecules called pyruvate. The pyruvate molecules are sometimes called pyruvatic acid. Then, the pyruvate molecules are now small enough to get into the mitochondria. And then the Krebs cycle happens. And it's also called the citric acid cycle. In the Krebs cycle, oxygen is now used along with a coenzyme called NADH. You don't need to know what it stands for. But it is a coenzyme that means it's going to help a chemical reaction to take place. That's what enzymes are for. They're helping something else. This reaction breaks the pyruvate into some smaller molecules, and one of those smaller molecules is carbon dioxide, which we will then exhale once our blood cells deliver it back to the alveoli. And it also makes another coenzyme called FADH. Again, don't worry about what it stands for. And the third step is something called the electron transport chain. And this is a very complicated series of reactions where basically oxygen and those coenzymes, FADH, NADH, they're passing these hydrogen molecules or hydrogen atoms from one molecule to another until they get to this one enzyme here called ATP synthase. And the ATP synthase creates ATP. It's basically putting together all the pieces from the previous chemical reactions with the pieces of atoms from the coenzymes, and out comes this big, huge molecule called ATP, which our cells use for energy. It's a very complicated, long process, but I'm trying to just boil it down to just the basics, since that's all we're going to be quizzed on this time. You'll go into more detail in biology in high school. Then we talked about respiratory disorders, and I chose 3 that are pretty common, but millions of people suffer from some form of respiratory disorder, and some of them, they're contagious, some of them are chronic, which just means that they happen over a long period of time, and some are genetic, meaning you're born with it, so there's nothing you did to catch it or suffer from it. The first one we talked about is asthma, and I would say this is the most common respiratory condition or disorder. It happens when the bronchioles become inflamed or they swell, they get narrower, as you can see in this picture, a normal bronchiole and a constricted one. At the same time, there's some mucus that is formed here as a way to battle with the reaction, asthma attack. Sometimes your body makes this mucus that has to be coughed up. And of course, this is very difficult to breathe in compared to this. It's caused by several things. One is an allergic reaction. Maybe it's an allergy to pets or animals or dust, or even an anaphylactic shock like peanuts or a bee sting can cause an asthma attack and make it difficult to breathe. Smoking and air pollution are both ways that we can get asthma from the environment around us. So being a cigarette smoker can lead to asthma, but so can living in a very congested, polluted city with lots of buses, cars, and smokestacks all around us. Some respiratory illnesses can lead to an asthma attack, like a cold or pneumonia or emphysema that we'll talk about later. Some people even react to cold air in their lungs, causes their airways to close up, and there's something called exercise-induced asthma, and I have that sometimes, but it's just simply a reaction to too much cardiovascular exercise. Might mean that the person needs to have an intervention to open up their airways. You don't need to know all these symptoms, but they're here in case you're curious. What you would want to know next is, what is the treatment for asthma? It's usually managed with something called a rescue inhaler. And here's a picture of a rescue inhaler. And rescue inhalers are used for emergencies or for just maintenance, that if somebody is feeling an asthma attack, the medicine in this inhaler is called albuterol, and it's pumped into your lungs through a mist that you breathe in, and that opens up your airways. Some people have asthma so badly that they have to have what's called a controller inhaler. You may have heard them called also nebulizers, where they take a mist, they breathe in a mist every day to prevent an asthma attack. And this is usually some form of steroid that keeps the airways open so that they don't get the asthma attack. And there's even oral steroids, pills that people can take that can keep the airways open. And of course, when I say steroids, they're not the same steroids that people might use illegally to make their muscles bigger and stronger. There's many, many, many types of steroids. They all just cause a physical reaction in our body, and in this case, it's causing our bronchioles to open up. Then there's emphysema, also known as COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. As I said before, chronic means ongoing, continuous problem. Obstructive means something is being blocked. Pulmonary means lung. And there's a lot of different types of COPD. Smoking is the most common cause of emphysema. But there's also a genetic form of emphysema, so it's not their fault that they got it, but smoking is definitely one high-risk issue. And as it says in the picture, this can also lead to a lot of bronchitis because there's mucus in the bronchioles and a lot of infections that can happen because of the blockages in the lungs. This is what a smoker's lung looks like with emphysema, and all this black is tar that came actually in from the cigarette smoke. So you can see how this would cause a lot of blockages, and this person would not be able to breathe very well. This is a healthy human lung. There might be a few things here and there due to just environmental pollutants, but definitely much more clear and can take a lot more air in and out than this one. Again, you don't have to list all these symptoms, but you can list a few if you like in your notes. And then the treatment is another rescue inhaler, just like with asthma. There are also oral steroids or inhaled steroids that can help to make it better. But unlike asthma, emphysema doesn't just come and go. There's no emphysema attack like an asthma attack. Emphysema is a chronic problem that's going to keep getting worse and worse until, the only thing I can think of is that the person stops smoking early enough that their lungs can still then heal. But I don't even know if there's a cure for emphysema. And lastly, we talked about pneumonia, and what it is it's an infection of the alveoli. It's the problem of fluid filling up those sacs of air. And that fluid fills up because of an infection. So sometimes that infection is bacteria, a bacteria that you inhaled that got into your lungs. It could be a virus. It could even be a fungus. As the mold spores are floating around in the air and we inhale them, sometimes they will cause a pneumonia reaction, an infection. Here are the symptoms, and a lot of people during class asked about walking pneumonia. Well, walking pneumonia is just a very mild form of pneumonia, and I imagine they wouldn't have a lot of these whole body issues. Like they wouldn't have fever, chills, dehydration, fatigue, loss of appetite, malaise, clammy skin, sweating. Someone who has all these symptoms would not be wanting to walk around and going to work, going to school. But if you don't have those symptoms, but you do have some chest pain and some shallow breathing and maybe some coughing, then that might be diagnosed as walking pneumonia. Treatment depends on what's causing it. So if it's caused by a bacteria, antibiotics is the answer. Viruses, as you know, there's no cure for. Your body will just have to fight off the virus and learn how to disable it with antibodies. But some people, usually people in their over 60, can get a vaccine so they can prevent getting pneumonia. Or if someone is sick some other way and has a compromised immune system, they might get the pneumonia vaccine. And if it's caused by a fungus, then there's antifungal medicines that can kill the fungus and help your lungs to heal. Well, that's it for our notes on the respiratory system. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email and let me know.